Okay, let's dive right into this fascinating explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really incredible, imaginary, high stakes debate between the legendary author Ernest Hemingway himself and some of the world's top literary scholars about his absolute masterpiece, The Old Man and the Sea. We're going to see what happens when the creator of a story sits down with the folks who have literally spent decades analyzing every single word of it.
So, here's our agenda for today. We're looking at 1. Victory or necessary illusion. 2. Courage, pride, and excess. 3. The truth about symbols. 4. The pilgrim and his pain. 5. The power of love. And finally, number 6. Why the story endures.
All right, part 1, victory or necessary illusion. Did Santiago truly win? In our imaginary debate, Hemingway takes a very literal, straightforward stance here. He insists that the sheer physical act of catching the marlin and bringing back its enormous skeleton is undeniable proof of victory. You know, to Hemingway, a fisherman goes out to catch a fish, and Santiago did exactly that. The bones prove the voyage wasn't a total failure, plain and simple. But contrasting that, scholar Susan Beegel brings up a really powerful counterpoint. She points out that the marlin, Santiago's own physical body, and the boy Manolin all paid a massive, heavy price for this so-called triumph. The sea became a stage for a man to test himself, right? And Beegel warns against turning that level of intense suffering into just a simple, romanticized victory. Which brings us to this incredibly famous line, destroyed but not defeated. Now, scholars interpret this not as some catchy slogan of pure victory, but rather as a testament to a man passing through total, devastating failure and returning with a heavy physical burden. He doesn't just float above failure, he survives it. Moving on to part 2, courage, pride, and excess. The dual nature of the hero. This brilliantly illustrates the tension of his character. On one hand, you've got heroic courage, venturing out into deep water to prove his capability. But on the other hand, there's this self-destructive pride. I mean, he admits he went out too far. His heroic perseverance is dangerously fused with this obsession to prove he is still a great fisherman. Now, Hemingway hears these scholarly warnings about Santiago's dangerous excess, but he counters them beautifully. He reminds the room that excellence inherently requires a certain level of recklessness. To do something truly great, to prove you're still capable, eventually, you just have to leave safety behind and risk going out too far. So, part 3, the truth about symbols. Is a fish just a fish? Hemingway notoriously hated when readers turned his vivid physical world into a giant symbolic puzzle. He argued that if a reader stops seeing the actual saltwater because every single wave has become a symbol, well, then something precious and real has been lost. He really wanted to protect the literal reality of the story. However, if you look at this table, the scholars push back gently. They argue that these literal elements organically gather immense meaning. Yes, the marlin is a real fish, but it also becomes a worthy opponent. The sea is water, but it's also a mysterious, holy space. The scholars essentially prove that a bell can just be a bell, but still ring far beyond itself. Okay, part 4, the pilgrim and his pain. Echoes of the sacred. We really have to ask this direct question, given how often readers project an image of the Christian savior onto the old fisherman. Is Santiago a Christ figure? Are these connections intentional? And what do they actually mean for the story? Take a look at the undeniable physical shapes of suffering here that mirror Christ. We've got the name Santiago, which translates to St. James, the bleeding hands from the fishing line, carrying the heavy mast up the hill like a cross, and sleeping face down with his arms extended. Yet the scholars stress that Santiago is a flawed mortal who went out too far for his own pride, not a perfect savior redeeming the sins of the world. Scholar H.R. Stoneback perfectly frames this. He suggests looking at Santiago not as Christ, but as a flawed pilgrim. You see, he journeys into the deep, sacred space of the sea, faces his own pride, and returns home stripped of his prize. Burdened, sure, but ultimately changed by the journey. Which leads us to part 5, the power of love, the redeeming bond. When pushed on whether suffering actually produced any wisdom for Santiago, Hemingway admitted in this imaginary talk that pain alone doesn't redeem a man. Pain can just make a man cruel or small. It is the boy, Manolin waiting for him with love and care, that makes the ultimate difference in the end. As you can see here, Manolin completely reverses the traditional hierarchy between them. He starts out as the apprentice, learning to fish, but becomes a witness to Santiago's wounds, and eventually a caregiver who brings coffee and cries for him. He teaches the old man that he can be cared for, that he can be mourned, without losing a single ounce of his dignity. And this quote from Susan Beegel perfectly summarizes the profound impact of Manolin. The story redefines an older, brittle masculine code that says a man must suffer alone to be strong. Instead, it allows Santiago's solitary suffering to give way to a tender, loving dependence on the boy. Finally, Part 6, Why the Story Endures. A masterpiece of ambiguity. Why does it endure? Because it acts as a mirror. It doesn't force one single meaning onto you. Instead, it offers multiple doors of entry, inviting every single person to enter through a different door depending on their own life experiences. It can be an adventure story of survival, a classic tragedy of pride, an ecological piece, a Christian parable, or a reflection on aging and legacy, all at once. Even Hemingway himself realizes at the end of this imaginary debate that living stories continue speaking long after the author falls silent. They survive simply because every generation brings its own unique burdens, fears, and questions to the text, finding totally new meaning in the old man's struggle. Great literature gives new questions, not permanent answers. So, I leave you with this final provocative thought. What is the marlin you are endlessly chasing? And who is waiting for you when you return? To dive into the full imaginary conversation we covered today, please visit imaginarytalks.com/The Old Man and the Sea explained by top scholars. Keep asking questions and keep learning.